I want to invite you this morning to open up to the book of Ruth. We're going to continue our study from that book this morning, Ruth chapter 1. And as we start this morning, I want to go ahead and read a few verses from Ruth chapter 1. And so if you will, begin with me. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And these took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband.' And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me.' Then they lifted up their voices again and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, 'See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you.' And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And so the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?' And she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?' And so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, it says. I want to begin our study this morning with one basic principle that I hope to emphasize as we study this morning. And that principle is that real love is difficult. And one of the reasons so many people fail when it comes to love is because they're looking for a kind of love that is easy. They're looking, for something that's not going to take much effort. They're not willing to work at it. And that's true in so many different relationships. That's true whether we're talking about the relationship of husbands and wives, or whether we're talking about the relationship that brothers and sisters in Christ have, or the relationship that we have with the Lord, or really any relationship you want to talk about that's worth talking about. We want loving relationships, but we don't really want them to be costly. We want it to be easy. And the scriptures tell us that if we're going to love like the Lord wants us to, if we're going to have the kinds of relationships that he wants us to, that we'd better get ready for some difficulties, because love requires us to do some difficult things. Can't help but see that as you go through the scriptures. It requires us to do things like forgive people. Jesus would say that we're to forgive 70 times 7. You don't have to do math, that's just a lot. And that's in contrast with Peter, who would, go to the Lord and say, hey, how many times, Lord? I'm willing to go up to about 7 or so. But the point that Jesus was making is that we need to be willing to forgive as many times as necessary. We're even required to love our enemies. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 35, Jesus said, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. How's that for difficult? And so over and over again, the scriptures show us that love is a difficult business. But I'll tell you something else that is even more difficult than love, and that is living life without close relationships. Seems to me that may be something Naomi learned during her time in Moab. She came to realize how good she had it back in Bethlehem about a decade earlier. Yeah, there had been a famine in the land, and it wasn't easy because of that, but she was full. In fact, that's what she says down there in verse 21. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. And that had to do more with her family, I'm convinced, than it did her financial situation. That really wasn't about her bank account. It was about what had happened in her family. And so what makes life full, or what makes life empty? And the answer to that, we all should understand, is that it's relationships. And if you're going to have relationships, you might as well get ready for the fact that there will sometimes be difficulties of one kind or another. Relationships require love, and there is no such thing as easy love. And so in our study this morning, we're going to talk some about the difficulties of love. And we're not going to cover everything that could be said about that. There are a lot of things that we could go through the scriptures and talk about, but we're going to spend our time mostly here in Ruth chapter 1 and look at the things that are found here. And the first thing that I want you to see that we learn from the book of Ruth is that love involves grieving until it hurts. I struggled with the best way to say that, and I'll go ahead and tell you I didn't find it. But that's what I came up with. And the point I'm trying to make is that grieving hurts. It just does. It's a painful experience. And so our text deals with 3 women who had to deal with separation and loss. Each of them had to deal with the death of her husband. One of them had to deal with the death of her husband and the death of her 2 sons. And so we're told that Orpah and Ruth, that when Naomi, said to them, you need to go back to your families and you need to find husbands, that they wept because they didn't want to be separated from her. But this wasn't the first time they had wept. I'm confident that they had wept together in their losses. In fact, one of the reasons they were so close, I'm sure, is because of what they had gone through together. They'd experienced grief together. And I doubt I have to tell anyone who is here this morning that when you love someone, it hurts to lose that person. I don't believe the Bible teaches that it shouldn't be that way, that it shouldn't hurt to lose someone. Even if that person is right with the Lord, it's still going to hurt. And so the Bible doesn't say that we shouldn't grieve. It says, as Paul does in 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, that we shouldn't grieve as others do who have no hope. It's a different kind of grief, but it's grief. And I know that, and you do as well from our study of the scriptures, that death will ultimately be conquered by Christ, but it's still referred to as an enemy. You ever seen that? 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 26, the last enemy to be destroyed is death, Paul says. Still an enemy. I know there will come a time when God will wipe away all of our tears, but that implies that we're going to shed some tears, doesn't it? Doesn't it say that? All through the Bible, people practice something that we don't really practice much in our society. I'm not even sure we could probably define the word. That word is lamentation. What that means is that they gave expression to their grief. And so when you look at the scriptures, and especially in the Psalms, you find that people were not afraid to express what they were feeling. And they would put that into words sometimes. And so they'd say things like, God, why is this happening? Or when are you going to do something? Or when is your deliverance going to come? Or how long is this pain going to last? None of those are quotes, but just kind of general ideas. And when I say all of that, I don't want you to misunderstand what I mean. I don't mean that they said, God, we're going to blame you for this, or they were not going to wallow in their grief. That's not what we're talking about. Neither of those is healthy. But expressions of grief can sometimes be healthy. And so I don't think we ought to prevent the tears, but I don't think we ought to wallow in them either. Here's what we ought to do. We need to go ahead and shed the tears. And then we need to let God have them. And there's a reason why I choose to word it that way, and it's because of something that David said in one of his Psalms. It's in Psalm 56, and in verse 8, David would say this to the Lord. And I'm going to read from a little bit of a different translation than I normally do this morning. I like the way it words it. He says there in Psalm 56 and verse 8 to God, you keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. And so David seems to have at least a couple of things in mind when he penned those words. The first is that he'd shed many tears. I mean, that's just kind of what he's saying in that. But he was also saying that he was confident that God had taken note of every one of those. Isn't that what he's saying there? That God had kept a record of David's tears. And that's a touching picture of the kind of concern that God has for his people. I think we would do well to remember that picture. When we hit the difficult times, when we are grieving or whatever difficulties may come, that this is who God is. He hasn't just left us in that. And so maybe we're talking about a different set of troubles than those that David was dealing with in that particular psalm, but the principle certainly applies to what we're talking about. If we love other people and we invest in those relationships, we're going to get hurt somewhere along the way. Sometimes there's going to be loss, and that's painful. And what we ought to do when that happens is to learn to shed the tears and then let God have them. He keeps a record anyway. He's promised that there's going to come a day when he will wipe away every tear. But there is no way, as long as we remain in this world, to escape the fact that love involves grieving when it hurts. It's a fact of life in this world. But I think there's something else we can learn from the book of Ruth, and that is that love involves cleaving when it hurts. You know, we use the word cleave mostly to indicate the idea of separation. You know, a meat cleaver is designed to separate something, you know. And it's one of those ironic words that can be used in two different ways, and they're just exactly the opposite of one another. We're using it in the sense of adhering or as sticking fast or clinging as, one of the definitions for it. You know, in times past, the only hope that a widow without children, somebody like Naomi, the only hope a widow without children had was to get remarried. Maybe they could go back to their family if they were young enough and their family was still there. But somewhere along the way, it's either you have children or you get remarried. And the events of the book of Ruth took place in a patriarchal society where a woman's position in life was governed to a significant degree by the identity of her husband or by the identity of her sons. They owned the land, they owned the property, they had the status. And if you were a widow, there were, again, basically only two things that kept you from a life of poverty. You either had to have sons who could take care of you, or you had to be young enough to remarry. And when you look at what Naomi says here in chapter 1, Naomi understood all of that. Not only was she an older widow who didn't have much of a chance of finding a husband, she also didn't have any sons to take care of her either. And she didn't have any reason to expect a bright future in that society. And she knew what life was most likely going to be like for her daughters-in-law if they chose to go with her back to Israel. She wasn't going to be able to produce husbands for them, and therefore she couldn't promise them any kind of future. They were Moabite women, and Naomi understood that there was a pretty good chance they were going to have a little bit of trouble finding husbands in Israel because most Israelites are not looking for Moabite women. That's just how it went. And to return with her was to risk living in obscurity and uncertainty and poverty. And so that's why Naomi said what she did to Orpah and Ruth in verse 8 and verse 9. Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you've dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. Excuse me. It wasn't that she didn't love them. She just understood that their chances of finding husbands were better in Moab than it would have been in Israel. And she knew that they could find a future in Moab that just, frankly, she wasn't able to guarantee for them. There was no promises. But look at the response of these two young women to the words of their mother-in-law. Again, in verse 14, they lifted up their voices and wept again, it says. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. That's why I used that word cleave earlier. That's the concept. And what that means is that while Orpah loved her mother-in-law, she wanted to be a wife again. And the best chance for that's in Moab. But Ruth seems to have been willing to simply remain Naomi's daughter-in-law. I think that's basically what's going on here. And don't underestimate the significance of that decision on her part. When Ruth made the choice to go back to Israel with Naomi, despite her warnings, she was basically saying that she's willing to give up a life, give up future security. Give that up. She was evidently willing to give up the possibility of finding another husband to live with Naomi in poverty and uncertainty. That's what she's saying. I'll do that. If that's how this works, that's how this works. And so the word used in the verse we read a moment ago, Ruth clung to her. It's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 when it talks about husbands and wives. And it says, a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife. The older translation says, hold to his wife. In other words, she wasn't letting go of Naomi. She was completely dedicated to her mother-in-law. And you see that, of course, in the words that have been used many times before. In verse 16, don't urge me to leave you or to return from following. For where you go, I'll go. And where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. That's how it's going to be. And this is not negotiable as far as Ruth is concerned. And so her decision to stick with Naomi, it wasn't merely social in nature. There was a religious aspect to it as well. Ruth didn't want to leave Naomi, that's true. But it also seems that she didn't want to leave Naomi's God either. Evidently, she had learned something about the Lord during the time she spent in Naomi's household, even though they're in Moab when all of this took place. And so Ruth was willing to share Naomi's future, and she was willing to invest herself in Naomi's life. And I tell you, that says something about the kind of person that she was. I don't want to be too critical of Orpah because I suspect most people would have made the same decision that she made under the same set of circumstances. Most people would. But I do want to say that there is a kind of love that is capable of a very strong emotion. Orpah cried. She didn't want to go. And so there is a strong emotional aspect to it. There's a kind of love that has that, but doesn't really involve cleaving. Holding fast, not letting go. And that kind of love that doesn't involve cleaving is so prevalent today in almost any relationship you want to talk about in our society. People can handle love that is emotional in nature, but they draw the line when things get difficult. Isn't that true? Don't we see that a lot in our society? We see that in all kinds of relationships. But the scriptures tell us that there is a kind of love that is much stronger than that, a kind of love that holds on tightly even when things get difficult. Jesus would say in John 15 and verse 13, talking about an entirely different subject different kind of situation than what we're dealing with here. John 15 and verse 13, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Again, not dealing with the subject we're talking about this morning, but a principle found in his words. That is, love requires looking out for the highest interest of the other person. Isn't that what he's saying? Even to the point of self-sacrifice. That's the point that Jesus was making. And for Ruth, it involved putting her own future at risk. That's what's going on. Love involves cleaving when it hurts. That's a principle we need to recognize. But the final thing I want you to see this morning that we learn from Ruth, the book, is that love involves leaving our hurts in the hands of God. Have to learn to trust him. Have to continue to serve him, even when things are difficult. If there's one underlying theme in the book of Ruth, it's that things don't really happen by chance. Have you ever noticed how Naomi looked at everything that took place? She saw the Lord's hand in everything. And so she didn't say, well, ran into a little bad luck down in Moab, last 10 years. She said in verse 21, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. She believed that God was behind everything that happened in her life. And so the God that Naomi believed in is a sovereign God who brings his will to pass. And Naomi and her family lived in Moab for, again, roughly around 10 years or so. And the trials that came upon them, I suspect, were meant to get them to see that they'd made the wrong decision in going to Moab in the first place. And so finally the Lord brought Naomi back to the place where she belonged, but it wasn't under pleasant circumstances. It wasn't everything went great and here I am, I'm back. And what I think that says is that God sometimes has to empty people before he can fill them up again. And certainly he did that with her by her own admission. And really, maybe that's not entirely true. She did return with at least one thing. That is, she returned with a faith that recognized that she served a God who was in control. And of course, that was the underlying problem when the decision was made to move the family to Moab in the first place. Is God really enough in control in the midst of this famine to take care of us in the land of Israel? I don't think so, so we're going to move to Moab. But she learned the lesson. She returned to Israel understanding that regardless of her circumstances, the Lord's in control. And that was an important lesson for her to learn. It's a hard lesson to learn. It's not so hard when things are going well for us. When everything's going fine, yep, the Lord's in control and everything's great for me, that's wonderful. But we struggle when we don't understand what it is that God is doing. And it is hard for us to love him like we should and to serve him like we should when he's decided to get our attention in a way that is painful for us, isn't it? It's hard to love him like we should when he takes away what we want to hold on to and makes us empty so that we can learn to be full of faith in him. And so the lesson of this book can be summed up really by words that are found in the book of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other. It's a hard principle to learn. Everybody thinks that, God is only about just giving us what we want and making us happy. And that's just not it. There's more at play than that. And so are we going to keep our faith in God when things get difficult? Are we going to love him like we should even when he disciplines us? Are we going to turn everything over to him when he has to do something drastic to get us out of the far country and back home where we belong? That's what he did with Naomi. Will we trust him? The prophet Habakkuk wrestled with the concept of God's discipline. In Habakkuk chapter 3, actually you read all the way through Habakkuk and he struggles. He starts off and he's like, Lord, things are just bad around here and I really think you ought to do something. And so the Lord says, here's what I'm going to do. And he says, Lord, I don't think that's what you ought to do at all. He wants God to do something, but not what God plans to do. And finally, he kind of comes to terms with what God has revealed to him. And so he says there in Habakkuk chapter 3 and verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herds in the stalls. Bad situation. But he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. It's like, I don't know how this is all going to end. And frankly, it looks like it's not going to be very comfortable. But I tell you what, I'm just going to trust God. I'm going to take it that he knows what he's doing. And what that says to us is that loving God means that we trust that he does know what he's doing at all times, even when things are difficult. So we bring things to a close this morning. I want to point out that there's nothing in this world that is more difficult than love. And it doesn't matter what aspect of it you want to talk about, what relationship, again, we're talking about. Love is a difficult business. But what we need to see is that there's also nothing that is more rewarding. Not only in this world, but also in the world that is to come. God made us for relationships. He made us to have a relationship with him. He made us to have a relationship with one another. And then there are other relationships that he chose to bless us with, and none of them are easy. All of them involve difficulty somewhere along the way. We need to learn to trust him and to trust his plan and to keep following his ways because they are always best. We've not talked this morning about being a Christian or about how one becomes one, but we don't want to leave this morning without issuing the Lord's invitation. Jesus came into this world and he died upon the cross. He did that because of the love that he has for us. Love is difficult. Sent him to the cross. And the reason it sent him to the cross is because he wants a relationship with people. He wants a relationship with you. If you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ, then you don't have that relationship that the Lord wants to have with you. He came so that your sins could be forgiven, so you could be washed clean, so you could have a brand new beginning. But that involves a responsibility on your part. Love's always that way. It works that way. And so if you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ, then why not do that this morning? Why not accept the kind of relationship that God wants to have with you through Christ? One that involves benefits in this world and that, all kinds of benefits. The benefits that extend into the world to come. You believe that Jesus is the Son of God, why not submit to him? Confess him as Lord. Repent of the sins that you've committed. Turn away from those things and come this morning and be buried with Christ in baptism. You can be raised up and have that brand new life, that new relationship, that hope for the world to come. And if we can help you along those lines, we ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.